There are certain objects, places, and discoveries throughout history that seem to carry something dark with them, something invisible and relentless, like a shadow that latches onto every person who dares to get too close. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the stories you're about to hear are real. The people involved were real, and the deaths that followed were undeniably, tragically real. These are curses that killed everyone connected to them. In the autumn of 1922, deep in the arid landscape of southern Egypt, a discovery was made that would captivate the entire world. For more than 3,000 years, a teenage king slept undisturbed beneath the sands of Egypt's Valley of the Kings. His name was Tutankhamun, and he had ascended to the throne when he was only about 9 years old, ruling over one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever seen. He died young, likely around the age of 18 or 19, and his burial was rushed and relatively modest compared to the grand tombs of other pharaohs. The entrance to his final resting place was eventually buried beneath rubble from the construction of a later tomb, and with it, Tutankhamun slipped out of memory entirely. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell above the ground where he lay, and all the while, his burial chamber remained sealed, untouched by the grave robbers who had picked clean nearly every other royal tomb in the valley. It was this remarkable fact, this pristine, undisturbed state of the tomb, that made its eventual discovery one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history. But it would also be this discovery that gave rise to one of the most infamous and terrifying legends the modern world has ever known. The man who spent years chasing the ghost of Tutankhamun was a British archaeologist named Howard Carter. Carter was born in 1874 in Kensington, London, the youngest of 11 children. His father was an artist and illustrator, and young Howard inherited that same eye for detail and beauty, a trait that would serve him well in the meticulous world of archaeological excavation. Carter received only a limited formal education, spending much of his childhood in the Norfolk market town of Swaffham, but what he lacked in credentials, he made up for in passion and an almost obsessive drive to uncover the past. By his teenage years, he was already working as a tracer, copying inscriptions and paintings from Egyptian tombs for the Egypt Exploration Fund. It was grueling, painstaking work, but it lit a fire in Carter that would burn for the rest of his life. By the early 20th century, Carter had established himself as a capable, if somewhat prickly figure in the world of Egyptology. He was talented but temperamental, and his career had been derailed more than once by clashes with authorities and fellow researchers. But in 1907, Carter's fortunes changed when he was introduced to George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a fabulously wealthy English aristocrat with a passion for Egyptian antiquities. Lord Carnarvon was not an archaeologist himself, but he had deep pockets and a genuine fascination with the ancient world, and he saw in Carter the skill and determination that his money alone could not provide. Together, the two men struck a deal. Carnarvon would fund the excavation, and Carter would lead it. For years, the pair dug in the Valley of the Kings, searching for an intact royal tomb. Season after season passed with little to show for their efforts, and by the autumn of 1922, Carnarvon's patience and wallet were wearing thin. He told Carter that he could fund only one more season of digging. This was it. Carter threw everything he had into those final weeks, and on November 4th, 1922, a young Egyptian water carrier stumbled upon a stone step cut into the bedrock. Carter's workers carefully cleared the rubble away, and step by step, a descending staircase was revealed, leading down to a sealed doorway plastered over with the official stamps of the ancient necropolis guards. Carter knew immediately that he had found something extraordinary. He sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon back in England that read simply that at last they had made a wonderful discovery in the valley and urged him to come at once. 3 weeks later, on November 26, 1922, with Lord Carnarvon, his daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert, and a handful of others standing behind him, Carter chipped a small hole through the upper corner of the sealed doorway. He lifted a candle to the opening and peered inside. For a long moment, he said nothing. Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense, asked him if he could see anything. Carter's reply has echoed through history ever since. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things." What lay beyond that wall was staggering. Golden shrines, jeweled thrones, statues, chariots, and thousands of artifacts crammed into the chambers, all preserved in remarkable condition after more than 3 millennia. At the center of it all, in the innermost burial chamber, lay the mummified body of King Tutankhamun himself, encased in a series of nested coffins, the innermost of which was made of solid gold. The discovery electrified the world. Newspapers from London to New York carried the story on their front pages, and Egypt mania swept through popular culture. But there was a problem. Carter had struck an exclusive deal with the Times of London to cover the excavation, locking out virtually every other newspaper in the world. Reporters from rival publications, furious at being shut out of the story of the century, were desperate for any angle they could find. And when tragedy struck just a few months later, they found one that was far more sensational than any archaeological report could ever be. On or about March 6, 1923, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito on his left cheek. A few days later, while shaving, he accidentally nicked the bite open with his razor. The wound became infected. Within days, Carnarvon was running a high fever. The infection spread rapidly, progressing to erysipelas and then blood poisoning. His already fragile health, weakened years earlier by a devastating car accident in Germany that had left him partially disabled, could not fight it off. Pneumonia set in, and on April 5, 1923, just 5 months after the tomb was officially opened, Lord Carnarvon died in the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo. He was 56 years old. The newspapers went wild. Marie Corelli, a best-selling novelist at the time, had written a letter just weeks before Carnarvon's death, warning that dire punishment would follow anyone who disturbed a pharaoh's tomb. When Carnarvon died, Corelli was hailed as a prophet. She spread the now famous claim that the phrase, "Death comes on wings to he who enters the tomb of a pharaoh," was inscribed somewhere in or near the tomb. It was completely fabricated. No such inscription has ever been found, but it didn't matter. The legend of the curse of King Tut was born. And the legend was fed by a cascade of eerie coincidences. It was reported that at the very moment Carnarvon drew his last breath in that Cairo hotel room, all the lights in the city went out, plunging Cairo into sudden, unexplained darkness. Back in England, at Carnarvon's estate of Highclere Castle, his beloved dog Susie reportedly let out a long, mournful howl and then dropped dead. Whether these stories were exaggerated or embellished over time is debatable, but the power failures in Cairo were certainly not unusual for the era, and the time zone difference between Egypt and England makes the dog story almost impossible to verify. But the press was not interested in verification. They were interested in the curse, and the deaths continued. George J. Gould, a wealthy American financier and railroad executive, visited the tomb in 1923 at Carter's invitation. Almost immediately afterward, Gould fell ill with a high fever. He never fully recovered and died of pneumonia on May 16, 1923, on the French Riviera, barely a month after Carnarvon's death. Then there was Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert. Though he was not directly involved in the excavation, Herbert had visited Egypt and his half-brother around the time of the discovery. Herbert suffered from a degenerative eye condition that had left him completely blind. In a desperate attempt to restore his sight, a doctor suggested that his infected teeth might be interfering with his vision, and Herbert agreed to have every single tooth pulled from his head. The surgery failed to help his eyesight, and the resulting infection led to sepsis. He died on September 23, 1923, just 5 months after Carnarvon. Perhaps the most chilling death attributed to the curse was that of Hugh Evelyn White, a British archaeologist who had been among the first to enter the tomb alongside Carter and Carnarvon. In 1924, reportedly shaken by the string of deaths that had befallen his colleagues, Evelyn White took his own life. Before he died, he allegedly left behind a note, written, according to some accounts, in his own blood, that read, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear." Whether the note was real or a later embellishment is still debated, but the story cemented the idea that something dark and inescapable had been unleashed from that tomb. Then came Richard Bethel, Lord Carnarvon's personal secretary, and the first person to enter the tomb behind Carter. Bethel was found dead in 1929 in his room at an elite gentleman's club in London's Mayfair. The initial report said heart attack, but a closer look revealed that he had been smothered in his bed. The circumstances remain murky and have never been fully resolved. One modern historian has even attributed his death to the influence of the infamous occultist Aleister Crowley, though no concrete evidence supports this. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy before it was handed over to museum authorities, died in early 1924. The official cause was complications from a surgical procedure related to skin cancer, a condition that was almost certainly caused by years of radiation exposure in his medical career rather than anything supernatural. And yet, the timing was enough to add his name to the growing list. American Egyptologist Aaron Ember was friends with many of those who had been present when the tomb was opened. In 1926, his home in Baltimore caught fire less than an hour after he and his wife had hosted a dinner party. Ember could have escaped safely, but his wife urged him to go back inside and save a manuscript he had been working on. He did, and both he, his wife, and their maid perished in the blaze. The name of the manuscript he died trying to save was the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Whether the fire was connected to a curse or was simply a tragic coincidence, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. There was also Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's excavation crew and an Egyptologist from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Mace had helped Carter physically open the sealed burial chamber, and he was instrumental in the painstaking work of cataloging and preserving the thousands of artifacts found inside. But within a few years of the tomb's opening, Mace's health began to deteriorate. He developed chronic pleurisy and fatigue, conditions that worsened steadily over time. He eventually became too ill to work and died in 1928 at the relatively young age of 53. Pneumonia was listed as the official cause, but the decline had been slow and agonizing, and some pointed to the fact that Mace had spent more time inside the tomb than almost anyone else on the team. And then there was the case of Howard Carter's close friend, Bruce Ingham, who received what might be the most ominous gift in archaeological history. Carter gave Ingham a paperweight made from a mummified hand wearing a bracelet. According to the story, the bracelet bore an inscription that read, "Cursed be he who moves my body. To him shall come fire, water, and pestilence." Not long after receiving the gift, Ingham's house burned to the ground. When he attempted to rebuild, the new structure was damaged by a flood. Whether the inscription was real or later embellished is uncertain, but the story of fire and water following the mummified hand became one of the most repeated anecdotes of the curse. There were still others, people who had visited the tomb, photographed it, studied it, or merely brushed against it in passing, whose subsequent deaths or misfortunes were retroactively attributed to the curse. The media kept a running tally, and every death, no matter how unrelated or explainable, was added to the legend. In 1923, Egyptian Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey, who had once visited the tomb, was shot and killed by his wife at the Savoy Hotel in London. In 1934, Albert Lithgow, an Egyptologist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who had viewed the open sarcophagus, died after years of declining health. Even the flight crew that transported Tutankhamun's exhibition to London in the 1970s reportedly suffered a string of misfortunes that were blamed on the pharaoh's wrath. But here is the detail that skeptics always point to, the single most inconvenient fact for anyone who wants to believe in the curse. Howard Carter, the man who found the tomb, who opened the sealed door, who was the very first person to gaze upon Tutankhamun's treasures in over 3,000 years, lived for another 17 years. He died on March 2nd, 1939, at the age of 64, of Hodgkin's disease. If the curse was real, it seems strange that it would spare the one man most responsible for disturbing the pharaoh's rest. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 died within the following 12 years, a rate that statisticians have noted is entirely consistent with normal mortality for a group of that size and age. But statistics have never made for good headlines, and the curse of King Tut endures to this day, one of the most persistent and widely believed legends of the modern age. Now, that story involved a pharaoh's tomb and the alleged wrath of an ancient king disturbed from eternal sleep. But what if the curse doesn't come from a tomb at all? What if it lives inside an object, something beautiful and brilliant and small enough to hold in the palm of your hand? Something that has traveled across oceans and through centuries, leaving a trail of blood, madness, and ruin behind it everywhere it goes. The Hope Diamond is one of the most famous gemstones on Earth. It weighs 45.52 carats, a deep, hypnotic blue, and it sits today behind thick glass in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., where it draws millions of visitors each year. People press their faces to the case and stare at it, mesmerized by its beauty. What most of them don't realize is that the story behind that stone is soaked in tragedy, and depending on who you believe, anyone who has ever possessed it has paid a terrible price. The diamond's recorded history begins in the mid-17th century, when a French gem merchant named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier acquired a massive, roughly cut blue diamond during a trip to India, possibly from the Kolar mine in the Golconda Sultanate. According to the legend, and this is where fact and myth begin to blur, the stone had originally served as the eye of a Hindu statue, possibly of the goddess Sita, and Tavernier either purchased it or stole it. Temple priests, furious at the desecration, supposedly placed a curse on whoever possessed the gem, a curse that would bring misfortune, madness, and death to every owner. Some versions of the story claim that Tavernier himself was the first victim. After selling the diamond, he reportedly came down with a raging fever and died, and afterward, his body was torn apart by wild dogs. It is a spectacular and gruesome tale, but the historical record tells a different story entirely. Tavernier actually lived to the age of 84 and died peacefully, which doesn't exactly support the curse narrative. But the legend, once set in motion, was unstoppable. Tavernier sold the diamond to King Louis XIV of France in 1668 for a sum that included a title of nobility and other privileges. The king had his court jeweler recut the stone into a 67-carat gem known as the French blue, and it became one of the crown jewels of France. For over a century, it passed through the French royal line without obvious incident. But when it reached the hands of King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, the story took a darker turn. Both were executed by guillotine during the French Revolution, their heads severed before jeering crowds. Whether the diamond had anything to do with the political upheaval that consumed them is a stretch by any measure, but their gruesome deaths added fuel to the curse's legend. During the chaos of the Revolution, the French blue was stolen from the Garde Meuble, the royal storehouse, on the night of September 11th, 1792, along with other crown jewels. The diamond vanished from the historical record for nearly 2 decades. When it resurfaced in London in the early 1800s, it had been recut into a smaller stone, the 45-carat blue diamond that we now know. It passed through several hands, including those of a London diamond merchant named Daniel Eliasson, and possibly into the possession of King George IV of England, whose legendary financial mismanagement left his estate so deeply in debt that the stone had to be sold upon his death in 1830 just to settle what he owed. The diamond eventually found its way to Henry Philip Hope, a wealthy London banking heir, who included it in his published gem catalog in 1839, giving the stone its now famous name. Hope died just months after listing the diamond. The stone stayed in the Hope family for the next 57 years, passing through heirs whose lives were marked by gambling debts, broken marriages, and financial ruin. The last Hope to own it was May Yohei, an American actress who had married into the family. She endured 2 disastrous marriages, lost her fortune, and died penniless in 1938. Whether the diamond was to blame, or whether the Hopes simply had a talent for self-destruction, is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. After the Hope family parted with the stone, it changed hands several more times, and the stories continued. A Dutch jeweler named Wilhelm Fals was tasked with recutting the diamond, and according to the legend, his son Hendrik murdered him, stole the stone, and then took his own life. A Greek merchant named Simon Maoncharides reportedly owned the diamond for a time before driving his car off a cliff, killing himself, his wife, and their child. The Turkish Sultan Abdul Hamid II was said to have purchased the diamond, only to be deposed and exiled. Each new owner seemed to bring a fresh chapter of catastrophe to the diamond's resume, and with each story, the legend grew more vivid and more frightening. But the most extensively documented chapter of the Hope Diamond's cursed history belongs to Evelyn Walsh McLean, an American socialite and mining heiress who purchased the diamond in 1911. McLean was born in Leadville, Colorado in 1886. Her father, Thomas Walsh, was an Irish immigrant miner who struck gold in the Camp Bird mine, becoming one of the wealthiest men in America. In 1908, Evelyn married Edward Beale McLean, heir to the Washington Post and Cincinnati Enquirer fortunes. Together, they were one of the richest and most extravagant couples in Washington, D.C., known for lavish parties, reckless spending, and a lifestyle that made headlines on both coasts. The jeweler Pierre Cartier, who owned the diamond at the time, was savvy enough to know that the curse might actually be a selling point for a woman like Evelyn. He reframed the diamond's dark history as an alluring narrative, spinning tales of doomed French royals, murdered jewelers, and ruined empires. Evelyn was fascinated. She believed that objects traditionally considered bad luck brought her good fortune, and she saw the Hope Diamond as the ultimate test of that theory. Her husband paid Cartier $180,000 for the stone, and Evelyn became its most devoted owner. She wore the Hope Diamond constantly, to parties, to charity events, even while walking her Great Dane, who she reportedly let wear the diamond on his collar around their apartment. She never let anyone else touch it, but she never stopped wearing it. She even had it blessed by a Catholic priest, just in case, though she later described the blessing ceremony as being accompanied by dramatic thunder, lightning, and a tree being struck and splintered across the street from the church. In her 1936 memoir, Father Struck It Rich, Evelyn addressed the curse directly, writing that she knew better than to believe in silly superstitions, and yet, knowing better, she believed. She said she had come to feel that she had developed a sort of immunity to the diamond's evil, but she also confessed that she never let her friends or children touch it, calling it a foolish woman's fetish. And then the tragedies began, rolling in one after another like waves. In 1919, Evelyn's firstborn son, 9-year-old Vincent Walsh McLean, was struck and killed by a car while playing near their home in Washington. The boy had been dubbed the $100 million baby by the press due to his family's extraordinary wealth, and his death devastated both Evelyn and Ned. Some versions of the story claim the boy had the diamond in his pocket at the time of the accident, though this has never been confirmed. The nation mourned alongside the McLeans, and whispers about the diamond's curse grew louder. Then, Evelyn's mother-in-law, Emily Truxton Beale, who had reportedly nearly fainted when she learned her daughter-in-law had purchased the Hope Diamond, died of pneumonia barely a year after the purchase. Emily had been openly fearful of the diamond's reputation, and her death, while not unusual for the era, seemed to validate her worst fears. Her husband, Ned McLean, fell into alcoholism and infidelity, was eventually declared legally insane by a Maryland jury in 1933, was committed to a psychiatric hospital, and died there of a heart attack in 1941. Their family newspaper, the Washington Post, had to be sold to pay off massive debts, and in 1946, Evelyn's only daughter Evie was found dead in her bedroom. She was 24 years old. The coroner's inquest ruled it an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. Evelyn found her daughter's body herself. Less than a year later, struggling with depression and weakened by grief, Evelyn Walsh McLean died of pneumonia at the age of 60. She was the last private owner of the Hope Diamond. After her death, the diamond and the remnants of her estate were sold to settle her enormous debts. The jeweler Harry Winston purchased the stone and in 1958 made the decision that many believe finally ended the curse. Rather than selling the diamond for profit, Winston donated it to the Smithsonian Institution, mailing it through the United States Postal Service in a plain brown paper package insured for $155. The postman who delivered it was named James Todd, and even he was not immune to the legend. In the years following his famous delivery, Todd was reportedly involved in 2 car accidents, suffered a head injury, and lost his wife and his dog to untimely deaths, and his house was damaged by fire. Whether any of this was related to the brief moment he held the world's most cursed gemstone is, of course, impossible to say. Since the Smithsonian acquired the Hope Diamond, the curse appears to have gone dormant. The museum has called it nothing but good luck, crediting the stone with helping to build a world-class gem collection and driving attendance higher year after year. Researchers have since discovered that the Hope Diamond exhibits a remarkable property. When exposed to shortwave ultraviolet light, the stone glows a fiery, burning red, a phosphorescence so intense that no other blue diamond has ever been observed to match it. It is as if the stone itself harbors some inner fire, something that burns long after the light has been removed. Scientists attribute this to trace amounts of boron in the diamond's crystal structure, but the visual effect is undeniably eerie, as if the diamond is alive, pulsing with an energy that doesn't quite belong to this world. Skeptics have argued persuasively that the curse of the Hope Diamond was largely manufactured, first by newspaper reporters hungry for sensational stories in the late 1800s, and later by Pierre Cartier himself, who may have embellished the diamond's dark history specifically to intrigue Evelyn Walsh McLean into making the purchase. Many of the deaths attributed to the curse, upon closer examination, were not unusual for the times. Child mortality was tragically common in the early 20th century, and mental illness and addiction destroyed families regardless of whether they owned cursed jewels. And the story of Jean-Baptiste Tavernier being torn apart by wolves is almost certainly a fabrication, given that the historical record shows him living to a ripe old age and dying peacefully. But for nearly 4 centuries before it landed behind that glass case, the Hope Diamond left a trail of blood and ruin that stretches from the temples of India to the ballrooms of Washington, D.C. And some people still wonder whether the curse is truly broken or simply waiting. Now, we have talked about ancient pharaohs and cursed gemstones, about legends that stretch back centuries and cross continents. But what happens when the cursed object is not gold or diamonds or the sealed tomb of a king, but something far older, far more primal? What happens when the curse belongs to a man who died 5,300 years ago and whose frozen body lay forgotten in a glacier until 2 ordinary hikers stumbled upon him on a sunny September afternoon? On September 19th, 1991, 2 German tourists named Helmut and Erika Simon were hiking through the Ötztal Alps, high along the border between Austria and Italy. The Simons were experienced hikers who knew the mountains well, and on that particular day they had wandered off the main trail, exploring a remote ridge at an elevation of roughly 3,200 meters. That's when they spotted something protruding from the ice. At first, they assumed it was a recently deceased hiker, perhaps someone who had gotten lost in the mountains and frozen to death. The upper portion of a human body was visible, face down, partially embedded in the ice, the skin darkened and leathery. They reported it to local authorities, who dispatched a team to recover the remains. What followed was a clumsy, chaotic extraction that would make modern forensic scientists cringe. The body was prodded with ski poles, pried with ice picks, and at one point a pneumatic drill was used in an attempt to free it from the ice, damaging the hip area. The man's longbow was snapped in the process. His left arm was broken while the body was being forced into a coffin for transport. It took several days before anyone realized the full significance of what the Simons had found. This was not a modern hiker. This was not someone who had died last winter or even last century. Radiocarbon dating would eventually determine that the man had lived and died between approximately 3,350 and 3105 BC, making him over 5,000 years old. He was the oldest natural human mummy ever discovered in Europe, a Copper Age man whose body, clothing, tools, and even his last meal had been preserved in astonishing detail by the freezing alpine conditions. Scientists named him Ötzi, after the Ötztal Valley near where he was found, and he became an international sensation overnight. Ötzi was remarkably well preserved. He had 61 tattoos across his body, made by rubbing charcoal into small incisions in his skin. He carried a sophisticated toolkit, including a flint dagger, a longbow made of yew, a quiver with arrow shafts, a copper axe of extraordinary purity, and birch bark containers that held smoldering charcoal wrapped in fresh leaves, essentially a portable fire-starting kit. His clothing was made from the hides and furs of at least 5 different animal species. Analysis of his stomach contents revealed that his last meal, consumed just hours before his death, consisted of einkorn wheat, red deer meat, and ibex. He was, in every sense, a window into a world that had been lost for millennia. But Ötzi had not died peacefully. An arrowhead was found lodged deep in his left shoulder, having pierced a major artery. He had a deep gash on his right hand, a defensive wound that indicated he had been in a violent struggle in the days before his death. There was also evidence of head trauma. The consensus among researchers is that Ötzi was murdered, ambushed and shot from behind, and that he bled to death within minutes. Whoever killed him, and whatever the reason, his body was quickly covered by snow and ice, and there he remained for over 5,000 years. The scientific community was understandably thrilled. Ötzi represented an unprecedented opportunity to study Copper Age life in extraordinary detail. Researchers from across Europe descended on the find, and the mummy was eventually transferred to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he remains today in a specially designed cold storage cell. But as the research progressed, something unsettling began to happen. The people most closely connected to Ötzi's discovery and study started dying, one by one, in ways that seemed improbable, untimely, and deeply strange. The first was Rainer Henn, a 64-year-old forensic pathologist from the University of Innsbruck, who headed the team that examined Ötzi's remains. Henn was one of the first people to make direct physical contact with the Iceman, lifting the frozen cadaver with his bare hands to place it into a body bag. In 1992, just a year after the discovery, Henn was killed in a car crash while driving to deliver a lecture about his findings on Ötzi. He was the first name on what would become a growing list. Not long after Henn's death, Kurt Fritz, the experienced mountain guide who had led Henn and other researchers to Ötzi's body and later organized the transportation of the remains, was killed in an avalanche in 1993. Fritz was 52 years old and an expert climber who knew the alpine terrain intimately. He was the only member of his party struck by the avalanche, a detail that struck many people as eerily selective. Then came Rainer Hoelzel, an Austrian journalist who had been the only person granted exclusive access to film the removal of Ötzi's body from the mountain. He produced an hour-long documentary about the excavation. Just months after the documentary aired, Hoelzel was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He died at the age of 47. But perhaps the most haunting death of all was that of Helmut Simon himself, the very man who, along with his wife, had found the Iceman in the first place. In October 2004, 13 years after his famous discovery, Simon went hiking in the Alps. He disappeared. Search teams were dispatched, and for 8 agonizing days, they scoured the mountains. When they finally found him, he was dead, lying face down at the bottom of a 300-foot cliff. He had fallen during a freak blizzard. He was 67 years old, an experienced hiker who had spent decades in those mountains. And then came the detail that truly made people's blood run cold. Within an hour of Helmut Simon's funeral, the head of the mountain rescue team who had led the search for Simon's body, a 45-year-old man named Dieter Warnecke, collapsed and died of a massive heart attack. 2 men, both connected to the Iceman, dead within hours of each other. The following year, in 2005, Konrad Spindler, the lead archaeologist who had been one of the first to inspect Ötzi's remains and who had spent years studying the mummy, died of complications from multiple sclerosis. Spindler had been publicly dismissive of the curse, reportedly declaring, "It is all a media hype. The next thing you will be announcing is that I will be next." Those words, delivered with the confidence of a scientist who dealt in evidence and not superstition, became his epitaph. He was next. Spindler's death, while attributable to a disease he had been battling for some time, carried a particular sting precisely because of his defiance. He had dared the curse to come for him, and whether by coincidence or something else entirely, it had. And the final name on the list, for now at least, is Tom Loy, a molecular archaeologist from the University of Queensland in Australia. Loy had carried out groundbreaking DNA analysis on Ötzi, discovering traces of human blood from 4 separate individuals on the Iceman's clothing and weapons, a finding that revolutionized what we understood about the circumstances of Ötzi's death. Loy was on the cusp of completing a book about his work when he was found dead in his Brisbane home in 2005 at the age of 63. He had been suffering from a blood condition that was first diagnosed the same year he began studying the Iceman. 7 people, all connected to the discovery, recovery, or study of a 5,000-year-old murder victim, all dead under circumstances that ranged from violent to bizarre to grimly coincidental. Skeptics point out, quite reasonably, that hundreds of people have worked with Ötzi's remains over the decades and gone on to live perfectly normal lives. The 7 deaths, they argue, are not statistically significant. They are coincidences inflated by media sensationalism and our natural human tendency to find patterns where none exist. And perhaps that is true. But there is something about the story of Ötzi, a man who was murdered and left to freeze in the mountains, who spent 5 millennia entombed in ice, and who was dragged from his resting place by strangers, that makes the idea of a curse feel less like superstition and more like a warning. Ötzi the Iceman rests now in his refrigerated chamber in Bolzano, Italy, behind a small window where roughly 300,000 visitors a year press close to stare at his wizened, ancient face. And every single one of them walks away alive, at least so far. Now we have traveled from the deserts of Egypt to the frozen peaks of the Alps, but there is one more place we need to go, and it is perhaps the strangest destination of all. Because this next curse does not involve gold, or gemstones, or ancient mummies. It lives inside something far more modern and far more unlikely. It lives inside a movie. In 1982, a film called Poltergeist was released in theaters across America. Directed by Tobe Hooper and produced by Steven Spielberg, it was a horror film about a middle-class family, the Freelings, living in a quiet California suburb called Cuesta Verde. The family's youngest daughter, Carol Ann, begins communicating with supernatural entities through the television set, and before long, the house is under siege by malevolent spirits who abduct the little girl and drag her into another dimension. The reason, as the family eventually discovers, is that their home was built on top of an old cemetery. The developers had moved the headstones to make way for the housing development, but they had left the bodies in the ground. The dead were not resting peacefully, and they wanted everyone to know it. The film was a massive commercial and critical success, spawning 2 sequels and cementing its place as one of the defining horror films of the 1980s. But behind the cameras, something was happening that was far more disturbing than anything on screen. A series of tragic and untimely deaths befell the cast over the years following the film's release, giving rise to what has become known as the Poltergeist curse. And at the heart of the legend is a detail so macabre that it sounds like something from the movie itself. In one of the film's most iconic scenes, Diane Freeling, played by JoBeth Williams, is dragged into the family's unfinished swimming pool during a violent supernatural storm. As she struggles to climb out of the muddy water, rotting skeletons begin rising around her, the remains of the dead whose graves were desecrated by the developers. Williams spent 4 or 5 days filming that scene, thrashing in mud and grime, surrounded by what she assumed were rubber or plastic props. It was not until years later that she learned the truth. Those skeletons were not props. They were real human remains, purchased from a medical supply company, because, as special effects artist Craig Reardon later confirmed under oath, acquiring genuine human skeletons was significantly cheaper than fabricating realistic-looking replicas. Williams has spoken publicly about her shock and horror upon discovering this. She said that had she known, she might never have agreed to film the scene at all. But at the time, no one told her. The irony was breathtaking. A film about the consequences of disrespecting the dead had, in the making of itself, done exactly that. The first death connected to the Poltergeist curse came just months after the film's release. Dominique Dunne was 22 years old when she played Dana Freeling, the eldest daughter, in the original film. She came from a prominent Hollywood family. Her father, Dominic Dunne, was a well-known journalist and author, and her brother, Griffin, was also an actor. In late October 1982, Dominique had recently ended an abusive relationship with a man named John Thomas Sweeney. On the night of October 30th, 1982, while she was at her home in West Hollywood rehearsing lines for a television series, Sweeney showed up at her door. He wanted her back. She refused. What followed was an act of horrifying violence. Sweeney grabbed Dominique by the throat and choked her for what investigators later estimated was 4 to 6 minutes until she lost consciousness. He left her body in the driveway. She was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and placed on life support, but she never regained consciousness. Dominique Dunne died on November 4th, 1982. She was the first cast member to die, and her death had nothing to do with any supernatural force, but the cruelty and senselessness of it set a tone that would follow the franchise for years. Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a verdict that outraged the Dunne family and much of the public. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison, but was released after serving just 3 years and 7 months. The Poltergeist franchise continued with 2 sequels. Poltergeist 2, The Other Side, was released in 1986, and it introduced a new villain, the terrifying Reverend Henry Kane, played by Julian Beck. Beck was a renowned actor and co-founder of the experimental theater group The Living Theater, and his gaunt, skeletal appearance in the film was chillingly effective. But the reason Beck looked so emaciated was because he had been diagnosed with stomach cancer in 1983. He completed his work on the film but died on September 14, 1985, before it was released. He was 60 years old. The same film also featured Will Sampson, known for his iconic role as Chief Bromden in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who played Taylor, a Native American shaman in the movie. Sampson reportedly performed an actual exorcism on the Poltergeist 2 set, attempting to cleanse it of whatever negative energy might be lingering from the use of real skeletons in the first film. He died on June 3, 1987, at the age of 53, after undergoing a heart-lung transplant, a surgery that carried a very slim survival rate. But it was the death of the franchise's youngest and most beloved star that would define the Poltergeist curse in the public imagination forever. Heather O'Rourke was just 6 years old when Steven Spielberg spotted her in an MGM commissary and cast her as Carol Ann Freeling, the angelic little girl at the center of the haunting. Her famous line, "They're here," became one of the most quoted phrases in horror history. O'Rourke reprised her role in all 3 films, and despite the darkening cloud around the franchise, she remained by all accounts a happy, normal child who loved school, was president of her 5th grade class, and had a recurring role on the television show Happy Days. During the filming of Poltergeist 3 in 1987, O'Rourke's health began to deteriorate. She had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, but that diagnosis would later prove to be tragically wrong. The medication she was taking caused her cheeks to swell, giving her a distinctive puffy appearance, but the underlying condition was far more serious than anyone realized. In late January 1988, O'Rourke became severely ill. On January 31st, she collapsed at her family's home and suffered a cardiac arrest. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered that she was suffering from an acute bowel obstruction caused by a congenital intestinal abnormality that had gone undetected her entire life. She was airlifted to the Children's Hospital of San Diego, where emergency surgery was performed. The surgery itself was successful, but while in the recovery room, Heather suffered another cardiac arrest. Doctors performed CPR for over 30 minutes, but they could not save her. Heather O'Rourke died on February 1st, 1988. She was 12 years old. Poltergeist 3 was released 4 months later, with a new ending hastily assembled using a body double, over the objections of the director, who felt the film should not be released at all. 4 cast members dead within 6 years of the original film. It was enough to make even the most hardened skeptic pause, and the whispers about the real skeletons in the pool, the idea that the production itself had invited something dark by disrespecting the dead, only grew louder as the years passed. Zelda Rubinstein, the actress who played the diminutive psychic medium Tangina Barrons in all 3 films, addressed the curse in a 1988 interview. She said that she owed it to Heather to present her case as honestly and lovingly as she could, and that she loved the child very much and was still deeply grieved at her passing. Then she laid out the facts plainly. Heather died because of an undetected congenital anatomical defect. Julian Beck died from cancer in his mature years. Will Sampson passed away after receiving a heart and lung transplant, and Dominique Dunn died at the hands of an extremely ill-directed, passionate boyfriend. Each death had a rational explanation, and none of them required a supernatural one. And yet, the legend persisted, because the movie itself was about exactly this kind of thing, about what happens when you build your life on top of the dead and pretend they aren't there. There was even a minor cast member whose death, years later, was folded into the curse. Lou Perryman, who had played a construction worker named Pugsley in a brief, forgettable role in the original film, was brutally murdered in his home in 2009 by an ex-convict with a history of mental illness. His death occurred 17 years after the last of the original 4 deaths, and his role in the film had been negligible. But the curse narrative had become so entrenched that any tragedy, no matter how distant, was absorbed into the legend. And remarkably, the Poltergeist films are not even the most chilling example of a cursed production in Hollywood. Running parallel to the Poltergeist legend is the strange and deeply unsettling story of a screenplay called Atuk. Based on a 1963 satirical novel called The Incomparable Atuk by Canadian author Mordecai Richler, the screenplay told the fish-out-of-water story of an Inuit man from Alaska who ends up in New York City. Director Norman Jewison purchased the film rights in 1971, and screenwriter Todd Carroll adapted the story into a script that was shopped around Hollywood for decades. It was a comedy. It should have been harmless, but every major actor who became attached to the lead role died. The first was John Belushi. In the beginning of 1982, Belushi read the Atuk screenplay and was immediately enthusiastic about playing the title character. Friends and colleagues confirmed that he had the script among his projects. On March 5, 1982, Belushi was found dead in his room at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Hollywood. He had died of a drug overdose at the age of 33. Years later, production resumed with comedian Sam Kinison cast in the lead. Kinison began filming in February 1988, but the production collapsed after just 8 days due to creative disputes. Kinison reportedly grew dissatisfied with the script and demanded rewrites, leading to a lawsuit from the studio. On April 10, 1992, Kinison was driving to a comedy show in Laughlin, Nevada, when a drunk driver crossed the center line and hit his car head-on. Kinison died at the scene. He was 38 years old. Witnesses at the scene told a chilling story. They said that in his final moments, Kinison appeared to be speaking to someone that no one else could see. After Kinison's death, the role was offered to John Candy. Candy, the beloved Canadian comedian known for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and Uncle Buck, was reportedly reading the Atuk script when he died suddenly of a heart attack on March 4, 1994, while on location in Durango, Mexico, filming a Western comedy called Wagons East. He was 43 years old. His death occurred the day before the 12th anniversary of John Belushi's death, a coincidence that did not go unnoticed by those already tracking the growing list of casualties. It was around this point in the production's history that the press began speaking openly about a curse. The pattern had become impossible to dismiss as mere bad luck, and Hollywood insiders who had once laughed at the idea of a cursed screenplay were starting to avoid it altogether. Around the same time, screenwriter and comedian Michael O'Donoghue, the first head writer of Saturday Night Live, who had reportedly either given Candy the Atuk script or read it alongside him, died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 54. And then came Chris Farley. Farley, another Saturday Night Live alumnus who idolized John Belushi and modeled much of his career after him, was the next actor tapped to play Atuk. He was enthusiastic about the role and was reportedly on the verge of signing on, but on December 18, 1997, Farley was found dead in his apartment at the John Hancock Center in Chicago. The cause of death was a drug overdose. He was 33 years old, exactly the same age Belushi had been when he died. The final name associated with the Atuk curse is Phil Hartman, Farley's former castmate on Saturday Night Live. Farley had reportedly shared the Atuk script with Hartman and was trying to get him to take a supporting role. On May 28, 1998, just 6 months after Farley's death, Phil Hartman was shot and killed in his sleep by his wife, Bryn, who then took her own life. He was 49 years old. 6 people connected to a single unproduced screenplay, all dead. The Atuk script has become one of the most infamous unproduced screenplays in Hollywood history, not because of its content, which by most accounts is a fairly standard fish-out-of-water comedy, but because of the body count it has accumulated without ever being filmed. It sits today, presumably in the archives of United Artists, gathering dust. No studio executive has expressed interest in reviving the project. No actor has volunteered for the lead role. The screenplay has become something of a Pandora's box in the entertainment industry, a thing that everyone knows about, but no one dares to open. Screenwriter Todd Carroll, when asked about the curse in 1999 at his home in Tucson, Arizona, dismissed it as coincidence and practical explanation, saying he was not a superstitious person and that it didn't have any meaning to him. The screenplay remains unfilmed to this day, locked away in the archives of United Artists. And perhaps Carroll is right. Perhaps it is all coincidence. Belushi, Candy, Farley, and Kinison were all known for lifestyles that carried significant health risks long before any of them ever heard the name Atuk. Hartman's death was the result of a troubled marriage, not a troubled script. O'Donoghue had suffered from chronic health issues for years, and yet the pattern remains. Every major actor who expressed serious interest in playing Atuk died. The script has never been filmed. No one in Hollywood will touch it, and while the rational mind searches for logical explanations, there is a part of the human psyche, the part that has believed in curses and dark forces since we first huddled around fires and told stories in the dark, that looks at the list of names and feels something cold settle in its chest. Because whether the curses are real, or whether they are simply the stories we tell to make sense of senseless tragedy, one thing is undeniably true. These people are gone, every single one of them. The pharaoh's tomb claimed its visitors, one by one, in hospital rooms and burning houses and dark London clubs. The blue diamond devoured its owners across 4 centuries, consuming kings and queens and heiresses with equal indifference. The frozen man in the ice reached out from across 5,000 years and touched the lives of everyone who touched him. And a screenplay that was supposed to make people laugh instead became something no one in Hollywood would dare to touch. A jinxed document that sits in an archive like a loaded weapon no one has the courage to disarm. Sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that are true, not because they prove the supernatural exists, but because they remind us that the universe does not owe us explanations, and sometimes terrible things happen to the people who get too close to things that were never meant to be disturbed. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. It really does help more than you might think, and it means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe out there.